Creating a data file for analysis involves at least a couple of steps and can seem overwhelming. But if we take it step by step, it isn't too bad. The process can be summarized in two broad steps: preparing the raw data and computing scores. Preparing the raw data includes creating a file, naming variables, formatting data, and checking for invalid data. To compute scores, we need to move the data into SPSS and may need to reverse score items before we actually compute the scores. Before you move on, these slides use an example data set based on the short grit scale. A summary of the measure is included in the materials for this unit. You may want to review that document before moving on. There are also SPSS guides in class resources that correspond to each of these steps. Note, too, that the information in these examples is fictional. It was created to provide a teaching tool and should not be used as evidence of anything. In many cases, we can create our data file in SPSS and save a step later. I'll include resources about that in the class materials. But sometimes it's more practical to start in Excel. In our case, we can download the data from a Google form into Excel. We just open the file in Google Drive, go to the File menu, select Download, and select Excel. It will open the full data file in Excel. You might have already noticed that the file looks a little overwhelming and doesn't seem like something we could analyze with statistics. That's a good call, and part of the reason we need to work with it. We will eventually move the data into SPSS to conduct analysis, so we'll need to keep some things in mind to make our lives easier at that point. SPSS calls each of the questions in the dataset a variable, and the responses to each question data. The Google form identifies each question, or each variable, by putting the full question in the first row of the column, and the data in the following rows. SPSS won't be able to work with having the full question in the first row. SPSS doesn't work with spaces, among other things. Having that information also makes it complicated for us, so the first thing we'll do is change the first row. The easiest way to identify the variable is to include an abbreviation for the name of the measure and the question number, no spaces. In the example in the slides, you can see I started by changing the top row to SGS1, SGS2, and so forth. You'll need to make a similar change of your version of the data file for our project, including changing the variable names for demographic variables at the beginning of the data set. In the statistics overview, we'll talk about treating scale scores as interval data, so we would need to compute the mean and the standard deviations, meaning we need to change the data to numbers instead of words. When Duckworth, Peterson, Matthews, and Kelly developed the original, slightly longer version of this measure, they labeled the responses 1 through 5, as noted in this slide, so we'll do the same thing. In Excel, you can hold down the Control button and hit the F key to access the Find dialog. Then we select the tab that says Replace. From there, we put the wording for the response option in the top box and the number in the lower box. Then we click Replace All. If you copy and paste the response options, you make sure to delete any extra spaces at the end. The search feature is sensitive enough that it will say it can't find the phrase because it doesn't have those spaces at the end. Excel will go through and change all of the fields, and you'll see a notification that it's done. We'll need to repeat that step for each of the 5 response options. Before we move on, we want to make sure all of our data is valid. This is a good time to note that we don't need to throw out responses from a participant if he or she did not answer every question. SPSS adjusts analysis as necessary, so we can use the data that is available without messing up results because of the missing data. For example, in our data file for the short grit scale, you might notice that row 16 is missing a response for question 4. That's not a problem. Remember, though, that participants may respond in a way that does not represent a valid measure. It might be all negative, or all positive, or all in the middle. Some scales use reverse scored items to help detect that. In other words, they include questions that should have a different response than the others. In this case, we can still eyeball the data and note if there are any rows that contain the same responses for every question. If there are, we'll delete the row from the data set. In our data file for the short grit scale, row 6 is an example of this. The participant answered 5 to all of the questions.